A Great Argead Saga Alexein, Alexander the Great. Volume 1, Telesias, The War Dance. By Macaulay. A new episode every single day. Episode 32. Sparta, Wounded Lion. Desiccation of the Eurotas. To understand the world in 368 BCE, one must understand the anatomy of a dying titan. For over 2 centuries, the Peloponnesian Valley of Laconia was not a mere territory. It was a closed, monastic foundry that bred the most lethal land force in human history. Sparta was a society engineered with a singular, terrifying purpose: the total subjection of the self to the state and the total subjection of Hellas to the spear. The structural foundation of this hegemony was the Agoge, a state-mandated, Darwinian crucible that stripped boys from their mothers at the age of 7 to break their individual wills and replace them with the collective reflex of the phalanx. This system produced the Spartiates, the equals, a class of professional aristocratic killers who viewed manual labor as an absolute stain upon the soul and commerce as a form of moral rot. To insulate this warrior elite from the trivialities of economic survival, the state had conquered the fertile plains of neighboring Messenia, reducing its entire population to helots, state-owned agricultural slaves whose generational trauma, blood, and forced labor fed the Spartan military machine. For centuries, this formula seemed mathematically infallible. It was the Spartan wall of bronze that turned the tide against Xerxes at Plataea in 479 BCE. It was Spartan endurance that systematically choked the naval empire of Athens to death during the 27 years of the Peloponnesian War, concluding in 404 BCE, with Sparta sitting upon the absolute, unrivaled apex of Greek civilization. Their authority was absolute. Their crimson cloaks and lambda-stamped shields were a psychological terror that paralyzed enemies before a single blow was struck. Yet, the internal architecture of Sparta carried a fatal genetic flaw: oliganthropia, the catastrophic scarcity of human material. The rigid laws of inheritance, the high cost of maintaining common mess dues, and the pitiless eugenic culling of infant life meant that the number of true Spartan citizens was in a state of terminal, irreversible decay. While their Helot population multiplied exponentially, the number of Spartiates dwindled from 9,000 in the days of Lycurgus to less than 1,000. They had constructed a massive, top-heavy imperial ceiling, supported by a rotting demographic pillar. The collapse of this architecture did not occur through gradual decline, but through a single, revolutionary stroke of military genius. At the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, the Theban visionary Epaminondas deployed his 50-shield-deep oblique phalanx, systematically targeted the Spartan royal elite on the right wing, and slaughtered 400 of the 700 Spartiates present on the field, including King Cleombrotus. The physical wound was devastating, but the geostrategic aftermath was fatal. In the winter that followed, Epaminondas marched his armies directly into the Laconian heartland, a territory that had not seen the campfire of an enemy in 500 years. He did not merely burn their crops. He executed a masterstroke of political warfare. He liberated Messenia. In a single stroke, the economic engine of Sparta was severed from its spine. The Helots were transformed into free citizens, and their ancient capital was rebuilt as Mount Ithome, a heavily fortified anti-Spartan stronghold. Simultaneously, the newly minted Arcadian League constructed Megalopolis directly at the Laconian border, locking the wounded beast within its valley. By 368 BCE, the myth was dead. The empire was gone. Sparta was no longer a conqueror. She was a garrison under permanent siege, surrounded by her former slaves, stripped of her revenues, and choking on the ash of her own arrogance. Syssitia, Laconia. Late July, the Syssitia, common mess hall of the Spartan city-state, Laconia. The biting, predatory heat of late July hung heavily over Laconia, stagnating deep within the gorge of the Eurotas River, like a pool of molten bronze. The atmosphere within the valley was thickly compressed, choked by sun-scorched dust, the bitter residue of dying brush, and the dry, parched scent of pine needles baking under a pitiless sun inside the stark. On adorned stone walls of the Syssitia, the silence was absolute, a heavy funereal weight that rejected the very concept of comfort. This room, which had once echoed with the harsh, arrogant laughter of conquerors dividing the spoils of Greece, now resembled a tomb of living ghosts. At the head of the dark, rough-hewn wooden benches sat the fragmented dual monarchy of Sparta, a broken system of two kings from competing houses, now forced to share the bitter taste of ruin. The senior king, Agesilaus II of the Europonid line, sat like a withered ancient root of Laconia itself. Once the undisputed arbiter of Greek warfare, the elderly king was now a bitter, limping shadow, his mind a steel trap of furious resentment, pulling what few political strings Sparta had left from the darkness. Beside him sat Cleomenes II, the young, untested monarch of the Argead house, who had inherited his crown just 2 years prior after the sudden, stress-induced death of his brother. Cleomenes remained quiet, the heavy gold signet ring of his lineage feeling more like a shackle than a symbol of power as he looked upon the grim scene. Before the few dozen remaining Spartiates sat the traditional black broth, melazamus, a grim concoction of boiled pork, blood, and vinegar. But today, the meager meal felt less like a testament to legendary austerity and more like the rations of a starved garrison. Through the narrow window slits, the distant, shimmering outline of the Taygetus Mountains offered no solace. Beyond those peaks lay Arcadian spears. Across the western ridges lay a free Messenia. The heavy hoplites generated by the Agoge had once been recognized across the Mediterranean as an invincible myth. It was universally believed that no force on Earth possessed the capacity to obstruct their march or survive the precision of their shock tactics. Yet history, that clinical, unblinking sculptor, is engineered to systematically pulverize muscle in the exact order of its density and pride. Today, Sparta stood inside a bleak architecture composed entirely of its own shattered delusions, and the monuments of its subjects' relentless insurrections, nothing more than an aged, crippled lion forced into a limping, desperate retreat. Those Thebans! A veteran hoplite growled, his entire frame cross-hatched with a map of ancient battle scars. He stared down into his bowl of black broth before spitting violently into the dirt. His voice was a frayed, worn resonance scraped from the memory of a vanished glory. They chant beautiful incantations of freedom while systematically seeking to chain the whole of Hellas within a cage of Boeotian arrogance. Only we, the sons of Sparta, continue to aggressively preserve the absolute order bequeathed to us by our ancestors, the rigorous laws of the Agoge. Let them chant, muttered a gravelly voice from the head table. It was Agesilaus II, his old eyes glinting in the dim light like dying embers. He looked toward his son and heir presumptive, Archidamus III. Unlike the aging or untested kings, Archidamus was the true iron fist of Sparta's present, the active field commander, who, in this very midsummer of 368 BCE, had just led their forces into the Peloponnesian hills to unleash the ferocious, bloody vengeance of the tearless battle. Archidamus had systematically broken the Arcadian and Argive vangs without losing a single legitimate Spartan life, proving that while the lion was heavily bleeding, its jaws could still crack bone. Archidamus leaned forward, his knuckles wide against the stone table. The Arcadians learned what happens when they push the beast too far into its corner, he said, his voice low and dangerous. But a single victory in the hills does not restore the Cleroi. It does not put the chains back on the Messenians. And what of the northern dispatch? One of the elderly ephors asked, leaning across the bench, his wrinkled face shadowed by his heavy cloak. The report from Macedon. It says Pelopidas has completely crossed the Thessalian border. He marches into Pella to dictate terms to the Argead after the slaughter of their young king. A slaughter indeed, the veteran hoplite sneered, wiping grease from his chin. Alexander II was carved up like a sacrificial calf at his own festival. They say the regent Ptolemy orchestrated the butchery right before the eyes of the court, then moved straight into the queen mother's chambers to secure the throne. Barbarian chaos at its finest. Agesilaus II let out a low, raspy chuckle that sounded like grinding stones. Let them butcher each other until the Eurotas runs clear. A king dead by his regent, a court drowning in its own palace filth, it is the natural state of those northern mongrels. But Pelopidas believes his Boeotian shield can block a mountain landslide. He plays the role of international arbiter, Cleomenes II murmured, speaking up for the first time, his young voice tight. Thebes wishes to map the entire world under its hegemony, from the Peloponnese to the Danube. Then let him map the quicksand, Archidamus cut in, his eyes flashing with predatory intent. Father is right. Every step Pelopidas takes into the Argead court is a step away from our borders. Every sacred band hoplite playing nursemaid to a fractured Macedonian household is one less spear Epaminondas can wield to defend Megalopolis. The elder Ephyr leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The rumor states Pelopidas plans to take hostages from Pella to ensure their compliance. The youngest prince, Philip, is to be brought south in chains. A boy of 14 summers. Let them take the whole bloodline, Archidamus spat, striking the table with his palm. Let the Thebans tie their own hands with barbarian hostages. While Pelopidas plays judge in the north, we consolidate. We have proven at the tearless battle that our iron hasn't softened. The ghost of Leuctra persistently haunted every high council of state strategy. Yet, deep within their pupils, the volatile sparks of a desperate panic flickered. The memory of their humiliation remained a raw biological fracture that continuously leaked venom. Sparta had retreated entirely into a state of pure preservation, gripping the meager fractions of influence left to them in Laconia, while their intellects aggressively mapped the shadows, searching for any vulnerability capable of fracturing the iron framework of Theban hegemony. The Spartans were now prepared to aggressively swallow their legendary pride, locking themselves into any treacherous alignment, whether with their ancient rival, Athens, or the distant king of Persia, if it offered the mathematical probability of shattering the Theban yoke. Every shift upon the grand chessboard of Greece was subjected to their cold clinical scrutiny. Let them bleed their finest stock in that northern wilderness, the elder counselors whispered, trading conspiracies beneath the massive shadows of the Bronze House as Agesilaus nodded in grim approval. Let those highland barbarians execute the solitary task we failed to complete upon the field of Leuctra. We shall sit in absolute stillness, waiting for the initial fracture to mar the face of the Boeotian shield. As Pelopidas drove his column deeper into the political quicksand of Pella, the wounded lion of the south remained coiled in the shadows, waiting for the exact trice that shield would break into pieces, so Sparta could fully remember the sensation of its teeth sinking into the throat of the prey. The air in the chamber of Alexandria Ferry was thick with the scent of spiced wine and the stale, suffocating musk of paranoia. The tyrant sat hunched over a heavy oak table, his eyes darting across a chaotic sprawl of wax-sealed parchments. His fingers, adorned with gold rings that seemed too heavy for his twitching hands, traced the borders of the maps until they clawed at the parchment. "Speak," Alexander commanded, his voice a jagged, irritable rasp. "And if the news is as sour as the last, choose your final words with care." His commander, a man whose face was a collection of hard, unyielding plains, stepped forward. He did not look at the tyrant. He looked at the reports spread out like a death warrant for the region. "It is a storm, my lord. First, the funeral march of the Argeads was shattered, not by us, but by King Bartolus and his Illyrians. They have bled the Macedonian pride into the dirt." Alexander grunted, a thin, cruel smile touching his lips. "Bartolus knows the smell of a dying kingdom. What else?" "The situation in Pella has dissolved," the commander continued, his voice steady despite the tyrant's volatile mood. "Pausanias, the pretender, has seized the city. He holds the throne in a grip of iron. But the news out of the harbor is dire. Iphicrates is already sailing. The Athenian fleet is on the horizon, carrying an army intended to break Pella open." The tyrant leaned forward, the shadows of the flickering oil lamps dancing across his gaunt features. "And the Thebans?" "Pelopidas has mobilized," the commander whispered, the weight of the name making the room feel suddenly smaller. "He is marching the sacred band toward Pella. He claims he comes to mediate the royal succession, but we know the Theban way. He comes to stake his claim on the border." The commander took a breath, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "The chaos is absolute. The Macedonian house is at each other's throats, the Illyrians are raiding, and the Athenians are arriving. This is the vacuum we have been waiting for. My lord, shall we march? Shall we strike while Macedon is paralyzed? We could secure the border before the dust settles." Alexander stood abruptly, the chair scraping harshly against the stone floor. He paced the length of the room, his shadow stretching long and distorted against the tapestries. "You speak like a man who has forgotten how to survive," Alexander spat, turning to glare at his commander. "Attack? In this? You are a fool." He gestured wildly at the map. "Look at the board, man. If we move now, we invite the fury of everyone who has a stake in that soil." The Athenian fleet will grind Pausanias into the surf, that is inevitable. But look at the path of Pelopidas. He slammed his palm down on the point where the Theban line crossed their territory. He is marching with the sacred band. 300 of the deadliest infantry in the world. They are the pride of Thebes. You do not intercept the sacred band unless you want your own army dismantled in an afternoon. We do not touch them, and we do not touch the road they walk upon. Alexander walked to the window, staring out toward the northern horizon, where the faint, ominous glow of conflict seemed to paint the night sky. The Macedonian crisis is not a ripe fruit to be plucked, the tyrant said, his voice dropping into a cold, hollow murmur. It is a forest fire. If we run into it, we burn. If we wait, we watch the flames consume our rivals. Let Iphicrates ruin his fleet against Pausanias. Let Pelopidas exhaust his resources cleaning up the wreckage of the Argead house. We wait. He turned back to his commander, his eyes wide and unblinking. We hold our positions. We watch. We see how the blood spills, and only when the survivors are too exhausted to lift their blades will we decide who truly owns the future of Macedon. And if the Athenians succeed? The commander asked. Then we shall have a very polite conversation with an exhausted General Iphicrates, Alexander replied, his smile returning, sharp, thin, and entirely devoid of warmth. Patience is a weapon, Commander. One you would do well to learn before we need to draw it. Battle of the Hegemony Day 3, the new dawn. The heavy silence of the sanctum was thick with the exhaustion of the night. Within the cold stone walls, the boys and girls had finally succumbed to an uneasy slumber, their bodies spent from the frantic, jagged rush of the evening. But Philip lay awake, his mind a fever dream of tactical geometry. He couldn't sleep. His thoughts were tethered to the tunnel leading into the dark marshes, the rotted pier, and the tethered boat that represented his only path to the truth. He needed to know if the generals had truly held the port, and if the Athenian sails had broken the horizon. With the silence of a stalking cat, Philip sat up. He moved with agonizing care, sliding off the stone bench and slipping into the shadows of the tunnel entrance. He had barely taken a step when a hushed, sharp whisper stopped him cold. "Philip, where are you going?" Argead sat upright, his eyes wide and restless in the gloom. "We were ordered to stay." The queen, she said it was madness to move. Philip hesitated, his shadow looming large against the rough-hewn stone. He turned back, his gaze locking onto his brother's. "I know, but I cannot sit here, rotting in a cage, waiting for news that might never come. I have to know." "We must stay," Argead insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. Philip took a breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had made his mind up. "I'm going to check the docks, Argead. Do not say a word to the others. I will be back before the sun touches the ramparts." He turned to leave, but Argead moved with a sudden, uncharacteristic agility, scrambling off the bench to stand by his side. "I'm coming with you," Argead whispered, his resolve hardening. Archelaus went into that marsh and returned to tell the tale. "The stakes have shifted, haven't they? It's not as hopeless as it was yesterday." Philip studied his brother, searching for a trace of hesitation, but found only a mirror of his own restless defiance. He looked at the tunnel, then back at the sanctum door. "We don't know for certain," Philip conceded, his voice a low, analytical rasp. "But I suspect the risk is far lower than it was last night. Pausanias has pulled his men to the coast. Whatever remains in the city is fractured and desperate. If we are caught, well, the worst they can do is drag us back to this stone box. It is not life-threatening. Not yet." Philip gripped his brother's shoulder, a silent vow passing between them. Suddenly, the silence was shattered. It wasn't the rhythmic thud of the palace guard. It was a friction, the sound of steel scraping against a door latch, followed by a low, guttural curse. Philip surged upright, his blood turning to ice. Beside him, Argead bolted up, his breath hitching in his throat. The others stirred, a collective, stifled gasp rippled through the small group like a wind through tall grass. Philip gripped Archelaus by the tunic, his fingers digging into the fabric until his knuckles ached. He pulled his older brother close, feeling the radiating warmth of a body still heavy with sleep. Archelaus blinked, his pupils wide and unfocused, until the scent of cold metal and the urgency in Philip's eyes shattered his lethargy. "They're here," Philip whispered, the words barely a vibration against Archelaus's ear. They've cut the outer perimeter. If they're at the door, the loyalists are already dead. Archelaus stiffened, his breath hitching as the reality of the impending slaughter crashed down on him. Dead? He thought, his stomach churning. How could the guards be taken so quietly? His gaze darted to the shadows where the others slept. He saw the shift of movement, the soft, confused stirring of Menelaus, the gentle rise and fall of Euryno and Philena's chests. The exit? Archelaus hissed, his voice trembling despite his attempt at iron resolve. The maintenance shaft, Philip breathed, his gaze locked on the door, anticipating the first strike of a blade. Take them. Take Menelaus, Euryno, and Philena. If you hesitate, we all die in this cage. Move. Archelaus reached out, his hand trembling as he clamped it over Menelaus's mouth, just as the boy began to groan from his restless sleep. Menelaus jolted, his eyes snapping open to find Archelaus's face inches from his, pale, beaded with cold sweat, and twisted in a frantic urgency that sent a jolt of terror through the boy's heart. He's killing me, Menelaus thought, his heart stuttering, until he saw the jagged, terrified look in his brother's eyes and felt the dampness of Archelaus's palm against his lips. Archelaus leaned in, his voice a frantic, low-pitched vibration against Menelaus's ear. There, at the door, Menelaus. Don't make a sound. If you scream, we are all corpses. The sudden tension in the room was absolute, a suffocating weight that seemed to drain the very air. Euryno and Philena sat up in one fluid, terrified motion. They didn't need to be told, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of impending violence. What is it? Euryno whispered, the words barely audible, her voice a fragile thread that threatened to snap under the pressure of her own mounting panic. She looked at Philip, then back to Archelaus, searching for the comfort of a lie, but finding only the stark reflection of their shared doom. Is this it? She thought, her mind racing to the stories of the palace guards, the brutal, faceless men who didn't care for bloodlines or innocence. Are we going to be slaughtered in the dark like lambs? Silence, Archelaus breathed, his face ghostly pale in the dim light. He felt the cold iron of his dagger tucked into his belt, a pathetic, flimsy defense against the butchers waiting just outside. He didn't offer them comfort. He didn't have the luxury of mercy. He knew that one soft cry, one misplaced footfall, would invite a blade into their throats. He pointed a shaking finger toward the dark moth-eaten tapestries that hid the maintenance shaft. Move to the marshes. Keep to the walls. Do not stop for anything. If you hear someone behind you, keep going. Do not look back. Philena stood, her legs weak, her eyes searching the shadows for a way out. I can't breathe, she thought, the walls of the sanctum feeling as though they were closing in to crush them. If I turn the corner and they are there, what do I do? Go, Archelaus whispered, his voice cracking. He pushed them forward, a frantic urgency driving his movements. He watched as they pressed themselves into the cold stone alcove, their silhouettes trembling. He was sending them into the abyss, choosing their survival over his own place at Philip's side. Forgive me, he thought, catching Philip's gaze one last time, but I will not let them die in this room. If I don't move now, Archelaus thought, his heart slamming against his ribs, I am choosing our graves. Menelaus looked at Philip, his younger brother's face etched with a sudden, mature terror. Philip. Go! Take those torches, end of exit, you know boat is there. Hurry! Philip commanded, his eyes burning with a desperate analytical coldness that left no room for debate. Archelaus ushered them into the darkness of the crawlspace, his movements fluid and frantic. Philip watched them vanish into the throat of the wall one by one. As the last of them disappeared, the crushing weight of the responsibility settled over him. If they fail, the line ends here. Philip thought, his palms slick with sweat as he gripped his dagger. If they survive, we are the distraction that buys the future. He turned back to the door, the wood groaning under the first heavy impact of a boot. He wasn't just a boy anymore, he was a gatekeeper, and the gate was already cracking. Philip caught Argead's gaze. There was no need for words. They slid into the deep, impenetrable shadows on either side of the heavy oak door, vanishing into the gloom. The door shuddered under a violent kick. The wood groaned, hinges screaming in protest as it burst open. Two men stepped in. They were professional move and strike killers, Pausanias's shadow blades. Their armor, matte black and devoid of crests, caught the dim, flickering light from the hallway. They scanned the room, their swords held low, sweeping the floor in a deadly arc. "The sanctum is clear," the first assassin muttered, his voice cold and devoid of human empathy. "They must have taken the secondary passage." "Then find the entrance," second hissed. "The usurper wants heads, not excuses." Philip saw the first man's boot cross the threshold. He felt the phantom beat of his own pulse in his ears, the world narrowing down to the space between the assassin's neck and the wall. "Wait," he told himself. "Let him breathe." Now, Philip exploded from the dark, a blur of motion. His dagger found the junction of the assassin's gorget and shoulder, driving deep with a sickening, wet crunch. The man gurgled, a fountain of red mist sprang against the stone as he collapsed. The second assassin spun, his blade whistling through the air, narrowly missing Philip's temple. The force of the strike sent Philip stumbling back, his boots sliding on the slick floor. They locked blades, a frantic, desperate struggle of steel scraping steel, sparks showering the damp stone. "Brother!" Philip roared, his lungs burning. Argead emerged from the void, a silent ghost, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He didn't strike for the head or the chest, he didn't know how, but his blade found the assassin's thigh, driving home with a sickening resistance. The man roared, his knee buckling, and Philip pivoted, wrenching his own dagger free and plunging it into the assassin's throat in one fluid, savage motion, vacuum that seemed louder than the clash of steel. The two assassins slumped, motionless, their dark, warm blood beginning to pool across the cold sanctum floor, snaking toward the brother's feet. "They're dead," Argead thought, his mind recoiling as if he touched a burning coal. "I killed a man. I just took a life." The reality slammed into him, harder than any blow. His hands, still slick with the assassin's blood, began to shake uncontrollably. He tried to draw air, but his chest wouldn't expand. His throat felt constricted, his lungs demanding oxygen they refused to take. He was hyperventilating, the world spinning in jagged, nauseating arcs. He was a boy who had spent his life reading of heroes, never realizing the cost of their glory. Philip leaned against the wall, his own chest heaving. His hands were trembling, not with fear, but with the raw, buzzing adrenaline of the kill. He wiped his blade on the dead man's cloak, the motion mechanical, his eyes fixed on the dark, yawning hallway. He felt the cold iron of his dagger, and for the first time he realized it wasn't just a tool, it was an extension of his own will. "Argead, Argead!" Philip snapped, his voice regaining its sharp, clinical edge, slicing through his brother's panic. He grabbed Argead by the shoulders, shaking him until the boy's eyes finally locked onto his. "Breathe. Look at me. Breathe." I didn't mean to," Argead stammered, his fingers clawing at his own tunic, his face a mask of shock. "There's so much blood." "It's done," Philip whispered, his voice hardening into steel. "Listen to me. Run. Follow Archelaus and help him. I need to make sure there are no others coming, then I will find you. Until then, the others are your burden. You are the shield, Argead. Do you understand? Protect them. That is your duty. I'm not leaving you to face the rest of them." Argead protested, his grip tightening on Philip's arm, his nails digging into the cloth. "We came here together, You have too," Philip countered, staring into his brother's wide, terror-stricken eyes with a cold, desperate intensity. "If we are both caught, the Argead name dies tonight. The bloodline ends in this room. Is that what you want?" Argead shook his head, his jaw trembling. "Get to the port," Philip ordered, his voice brooking no argument. "If we aren't there by the turn of the tide, you take the boat. You go and you don't look back. That is an order." Philip didn't wait for a reply, nor for the shaking in his own hands to subside. He turned and sprinted toward the tunnel, his boots thundering against the stone like the heartbeat of a war drum. He was leaving the dead behind, but as he plunged into the darkness, he knew the hunt had only just begun. The usurper had set his trap, but he had failed to account for the truth of the Argead spirit : a cornered lion doesn't simply die, it learns how to hunt. Philip sprinted into the corridor, his boots striking the cold stone with a frantic, uneven rhythm. His lungs burned, but the horror he found forced him to push harder. He passed the mangled bodies of the loyalists, men who had sworn oaths to his father, now lying in silent, broken heaps. They are all dead, he realized, a cold, hollow ache forming in his chest. They stood for us, and they were slaughtered in the dark. He reached the stairs, his eyes darting frantically into the yawning ink-black void of the upper hallway. It was an expanse of oppressive shadows, silent, unpredatory. He didn't know if the killers were still lurking in the rafters or watching from the doorways, waiting to finish the work. He didn't wait. He didn't hide. He unleashed a scream that tore through the stagnant air of the palace, raw with desperation. Guard! Guard! The sanctum is breached. Moments later, the sound of heavy, rushing feet echoed off the vaulted ceiling. A detachment of palace guards, led by an officer with his sword drawn, rounded the corner, their faces pale with shock. Prince Philip. The officer stammered, staring at the boy covered in blood. There are assassins in the sanctum, Philip shouted, his voice cracking but commanding. Secure the area. Sweep every corridor. I need to know if there are more of them hunting in these halls. Clear the bodies and seal the sector. He didn't stop for the officer's questions. He grabbed the man by the breastplate, forcing him to meet his gaze. Listen to me. Send word to the generals, to my mother, to the queen, and to Gigia. Tell them the princes and princesses are alive. We have escaped the sanctum. We are moving through the marshes toward the port. Tell them to secure the boats, wait for us at the docks, but do not let the usurper's men near them. But, my prince. Rush, Philip roared, shoving him toward the stairs. I have to get back to them. My brothers are out there in the dark. He didn't wait for a reply, nor did he look back to see if the guards obeyed. He turned, his body aching, his mind a volatile mixture of grief and predatory focus. He plunged back toward the shadows, moving not like a child fleeing from a nightmare, but like a warrior sprinting toward the center of the fray. The usurper had turned the palace into a hunting ground, but Philip was no longer the prey. He was the shadow coming to reclaim his home. Near the end of the tunnel, the oppressive, stifling weight of the earth finally began to thin. Ahead, a sliver of pale, sickly moonlight filtered through the reeds, marking the exit. Archelaus stumbled forward, his breath hitching in his chest. We are almost there, he whispered, though his voice sounded hollow to his own ears. Menelaus remained deathly quiet, his eyes wide and vacant, his body trembling with a rhythmic, uncontrollable shiver. Beside him, Eurino gripped Philena's hands so tightly her knuckles turned white, her own terror buried beneath a desperate, forced calm. Philena, look at me, Eurino murmured, though her voice wavered like a candle in a draught. We will be fine. Philip and Argead, they must have dealt with them. They have to have. Suddenly, figure materialized from the gloom behind them. It was Argead. He was pale, his eyes darting back toward the way they had come, his hands still stained dark. The assassins are dead, he blurted out, his voice a jagged edge of shock. Where is the boat? We have to move, we have to get to the port now. Eurino's grip on Philena tightened. Where is Philip? Is he coming? Argead hesitated, his chest heaving as he struggled for air. He ran back to the house to rouse the guards. He said he would follow us. Archelaus wiped the grime from his forehead, his jaw set in a grim line. We should wait for him here. A little while longer. Back in the sanctum, the air felt thick with the metallic stench of the kill. Philip stood over the broken bodies of the assassins, his gaze unfocused. The realization of what he had done, the absolute cold finality of ending a man's life, struck him with the force of a physical blow. His stomach lurched, a sickening wave of revulsion rising in his throat, but he ruthlessly crushed it down. No time, he told himself, his mind retreating into a clinical, icy shell. Feel nothing. Just move. He knelt, his knees sinking into the damp, uneven stone of the sanctum floor. The room felt unnaturally cold, a biting, subterranean chill that seemed to seep directly from the marrow of the palace walls. It carried the cloying, stagnant odor of centuries-old dust, mixed with the sharp, coppery stench of fresh blood, a visceral matang that coated the back of his throat and made his stomach churn. He pressed his fingers against the first assassin's neck. Beneath the man's cooling skin, there was nothing, no flutter of life, no desperate rhythm. The flesh felt wrong, heavy, unresponsive, and already beginning to shed its warmth to the floor. He checked the second man, his touch lingering on the rigid, unmoving throat. No pulse. No heat. Just the growing, terrifying weight of a stillness that could never be undone. He was the hand that had consigned them to this hollow dark. The realization hit him not as a thought, but as a rushing, surreal strangeness, as if the room had tilted on its axis, and he were suddenly a stranger to his own hands. The silence of the chamber was absolute, broken only by the frantic, ragged whistle of his own breath. He surged to his feet, his movements jagged and uncoordinated as if his limbs were still vibrating with the recoil of the kill. He didn't look back at the ruin he had made. He turned and sprinted toward the yawning black of the corridor, the darkness swallowing him whole, eager to escape the lingering, sweet rot of the death he had just authored. At the tunnel exit, the marsh breathed around them, a suffocating, alien world of rot, shifting mud, and the unsettling hiss of nature. Menelaus finally broke, a sharp, ragged sob escaping his lips before he could stop it. Argead lunged, clamping his hand over the boy's mouth, his own heart hammering against his ribs. "Quiet," he hissed, his eyes searching the darkness for the flicker of a blade. Silence didn't just descend, it draped over them like a shroud, heavy and absolute, thick enough to taste. The air was a wet, suffocating concoction of decaying silt, rotting vegetation, and the faint, sulphurous musk of the marsh, which clung to the back of their throats like a bad memory. In the distance, the water slapped against the reeds with a rhythmic, wet sound, slap, suck, like a giant, invisible tongue licking the mud clean. The frogs were a discordant, maddening chorus, a wet symphony of croaks that seemed to mock the brothers' silence. Every time a twig snapped, a sound that shouldn't have been anything more than wood giving way, it shrieked in their ears like a death sentence. Their own heartbeats felt two loud, intrusive thumps that betrayed their position to the shadows. Philip could hear Archelaus breathing, a jagged, hitching sound that suggested the older boy was one snapped twig away from a complete psychological collapse. Then the world shattered. With a violent thrum that felt like a physical blow to the chest, a massive, dark shape erupted from the black tangle of the marsh grass. It was a heron maybe, or something older and stranger, its wings beating the air with a frantic, desperate velocity. The sound was deafening, a frantic beating of leather against the void. It was a jolt of pure, icy adrenaline, a jagged needle of terror driven straight into their spines. They all froze, every muscle corded tight, lungs burning as they held their breath until their vision began to swim with black spots. They didn't move. They couldn't. They were statues carved from fear, waiting for the inevitable follow-up, the cold bite of a serrated blade in the dark, the wet thud of a body hitting the mud, the scream that was surely coming. But there was no scream. Only the frogs, resuming their wet, monotonous chanting, and the wind, hissing through the reeds like the breath of 1,000 ghosts. The silence crept back in, but it was different now. It was hungry, alive, and watching. And somewhere in that suffocating blackness, the usurper's shadow was surely breathing the same air. Then, a shadow detached itself from the gloom of the tunnel. It moved with a predatory, restless grace, but the way it hesitated upon seeing them spoke of a different exhaustion. Philip stepped into the faint, silvered light of the marsh. He was covered in grime, his tunic stiff with the dark, copper-scented evidence of the sanctum, and his eyes burned with a dark, terrifying focus that seemed to age him by years in a single night. He was no longer the boy who had struggled to sleep in the sanctum. He was something harder, something forged in blood. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, his chest heaving, his presence acting as a silent anchor for the panic that threatened to tear them apart. In that hollow silence, a profound shift occurred. They were no longer just children huddled in the dark. They were the last vestiges of a lineage, a scattered fraternity bound by the cold steel of the usurper's blade. Archelaus, Menelaus, Euryno, and Philinna looked at Philip, then at each other, and in that exchange, the hollow ache of being hunted transformed into the sharp electric clarity of a common purpose. They were bearing a weight that no tutor, no king, and no priest could have ever taught them to carry. This was their singular, brutal curriculum, the lesson of the hunted, which required the instincts of the predator to survive. It was a dark, jagged wisdom that only they could cultivate, a shared, secret strength that turned their fear into a singular, unwavering resolve. Philip's gaze drifted from one to the other, his brothers, his sisters, and he saw the change. They were standing taller, their breathing synchronizing with his own. They were no longer children waiting for death. They were survivors choosing their path. He didn't need to offer words of comfort. He simply reached out, his hand clasping Archelaus' shoulder with a strength that spoke of a brotherhood baptized in the same fire. He then nodded to Eurino and Philinna, his eyes softening just enough to acknowledge the sisterhood that kept them from fracturing. They were a constellation of ghosts in the marsh, destined either to be erased by the darkness or to emerge from it as the architects of a new era. The hunt had not broken them, it had refined them. They moved together then, a single, silent organism of defiance, leaving behind the children they had been for the titans they were rapidly becoming. To be continued in episode 32-2, Arrival of Athenian Fleets. Watch and listen now. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Telesias Playlist. Bookmark Volume 1, Divine Oracle Playlist. Join the Vanguard. A new episode drops every single day until the epic conclusion of Volume 1. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Subscribe to follow the bloody rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.